They told me I was no longer his daughter. My stepmother smiled when my name was missing from the will. Sitting high up in the steel tower my father built. However, she had no idea that before he passed, he asked the old butler to hide the one thing that could burn down the empire she thought she controlled. The day I tore open that envelope was the day they lost absolutely everything. My name is Luna Flores, and at 34 years old, I found myself gripping the back of a polished mahogany pew until my knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. The air inside the ancient stone cathedral was not filled with grief. It was filled with the scent of expensive lilies, the stale musk of old money, and the metallic tang of calculated ambition. I stood at the very last row of the nave, as far away from the altar as one could get without actually leaving the building. Up there, bathed in the soft, artificial glow of carefully arranged spotlights, lay the casket of my father, Graham Blake. He was the titan of the Rust Belt, the man who had built Northbridge Steel Group from a failing scrapyard into a global empire that scraped the sky. And now, in his final public appearance, he looked small. Or perhaps it was just that the stage was so large, designed less to honor a dead man and more to showcase the power of those who survived him. I should have been in the front row, by blood, by right, and by every law of nature. I should have been the one receiving the condolences. Instead, that space was occupied by Serena Vale Blake, my stepmother, and Dylan Vale, the half-brother who had never lifted anything heavier than a silver spoon his entire life. From my vantage point in the shadows, Serena looked like a statue carved from ice and obsidian. She sat with a posture that would have made a ballerina envious, her spine rigid, her chin tilted at the exact angle required to catch the light. She wore a black dress that clung to her frame with indecent perfection, the fabric absorbing the light around her. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, and her lips were painted a shade of red that felt less like a cosmetic choice and more like a warning. I watched, feeling a cold nausea churn in my stomach, as she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. It was a performance art piece. I knew, with absolute certainty, that she was timing her tears to the rhythm of the camera shutters clicking from the press gallery to the left. Every time a flash went off, her shoulders would tremble just enough to suggest a woman on the edge of collapse. But when the photographers lowered their lenses to check their shots, I saw it. I saw the way she adjusted her diamond brooch, the way a ghost of a smile played at the corner of her mouth as she surveyed the room. She was not a grieving widow. She was a queen surveying a kingdom she had finally conquered. Next to her sat Dylan, at 25. He was a soft reflection of our father, lacking the grit, but possessing all the vanity. He wore a bespoke suit that likely cost more than the average annual salary of the workers in our father's mills. A platinum watch, heavy and ostentatious, glinted on his wrist as he adjusted his cuffs. He did not look at the coffin. He looked around the room, soaking in the attention. Every few minutes, he would turn in his seat, craning his neck to look back into the gloom where I stood. When our eyes locked, he did not offer a nod of sympathy. He offered a smirk. It was a look of pure, unadulterated victory. It said, without words, I won. The cathedral was packed. The pews were filled with the sharks of the business world. There were CEOs of rival steel conglomerates, major shareholders who cared more about the dip in stock prices than the loss of human life, and politicians who had spent decades in my father's pocket. They sat in rows of gray and black wool, murmuring to one another. The acoustics of the stone church carried their whispers like drafts of cold air. I did not have to strain my ears to hear what they were saying. That is the daughter, a man whispered 2 rows ahead of me, the one he kicked out. I heard she tried to sell company secrets to the Chinese, a woman replied, her voice dripping with scandal. Graham was heartbroken, absolutely heartbroken. It is a mercy he cut her off, another voice chimed in. Imagine letting a traitor inherit the empire. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. I stood there, rigid, refusing to let a single tear fall. I would not give them the satisfaction. I would not let Serena see me break. They could call me a traitor. They could rewrite history. but I knew who I was. I was the only person in this room who had ever loved Graham Blake the man, not Graham Blake the checkbook. The organ music swelled, a mournful, heavy sound that vibrated in the floorboards, and then faded into silence. It was time for the eulogy. Serena stood up. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, walking to the lectern as if she were floating. She gripped the sides of the wooden stand, lowering her head for a moment as if gathering the strength to speak. The camera zoomed in. The silence in the room was absolute. "My husband," she began, her voice trembling with a fragility that I knew was manufactured in front of a mirror. "My Graham, he was a titan to the world, a force of nature." She looked up, her eyes shimmering. But to us, to his family, he was simply a man who loved with a ferocity that terrified him. He built Northbridge not for glory, but for us, for his legacy. I felt a physical blow to my chest. His legacy. I had spent 10 years in those mills. I had learned to weld before I learned to drive. I had studied metallurgy while Dylan was crashing sports cars in the Hamptons. "We were a perfect, small circle," Serena continued, her voice gaining a theatrical strength. "He often told me that in a world full of wolves, loyalty is the only currency that matters. He valued loyalty above all else." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. Then, she did something that broke every rule of funeral etiquette, something so brazen it sucked the air out of the room. She turned her body. She turned away from the congregation, away from the coffin, and looked directly at the back of the church. She looked directly at me. The spotlight seemed to follow her gaze, and suddenly, hundreds of heads turned. I felt the weight of their judgment like physical blows. "Graham was a wonderful father," Serena said, her voice turning into ice. "To some of us?" A gasp rippled through the crowd. The cameras flashed rapidly, a strobe light of humiliation. "He was a man of principle," Serena said, holding my gaze, her eyes dead and cold. "And because of that, he was forced to make the hardest decision of his life. He had to cut off the rot to save the tree. He had to sever ties with the traitors in his own bloodline to protect what he built." My heart hammered against my ribs. She was doing it. She was not just burying my father. She was burying me. She was publicly executing my reputation in the house of God. "I am only fulfilling his final wish," Serena said, her voice projecting to the rafters, "to ensure that his life's work remains in the hands of those who actually loved him, not those who sought to destroy him." She turned back to the podium, dabbing her eye again. "The victim once more." I stood frozen. My hands were shaking, not from sadness, but from a rage so hot it felt like it could melt the steel beams my father was famous for. Then, movement in the front row caught my eye. Dylan stood up. He did not go to the podium. He turned around, facing the crowd, facing me. He began to clap. It was a slow, rhythmic clap. Clap, clap, clap. He smiled, a wide, predatory grin that showed too many teeth. "Bravo, Mother," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. He looked right at me, raising his voice so the reporters at the side aisle could hear every syllable. "Did you come here to smell the money?" "Luna." The shock in the room was palpable. People covered their mouths. "Is that it?" Dylan taunted, stepping out into the aisle. "Did you think, if you stood back there looking pathetic, we would throw you a few scraps? Father left everything to his real family, the family that didn't betray him." He gestured to the coffin, then to himself and Serena. "Go home, Luna. There is nothing for you here, not a cent, not a memory. You are a ghost." The humiliation was total. I could feel the heat rising up my neck, burning my cheeks. The flashes of the cameras were blinding now, capturing my shame for the morning papers. I looked at the coffin one last time. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to wake him up and ask him how he could let this happen, how he could let this woman and her son turn his funeral into a circus. But the coffin remained silent. I released my grip on the pew. My fingers ached. I turned on my heel. the sound of my heels clicking sharply on the stone floor echoing in the silence that followed Dylan's outburst. I walked out. I did not run. I walked with my head high, staring straight ahead, refusing to look at the faces of the board members who had once praised my strategic reports, refusing to acknowledge the reporters thrusting microphones into my path as I reached the heavy oak doors. I pushed through them and burst into the cold afternoon air. It had started to rain, a gray, miserable drizzle that soaked through my coat in seconds. I walked away from the church, away from the black limousines lining the driveway, away from the suffocating scent of lilies. I walked until I reached the edge of the cemetery, where an ancient oak tree stood guard over the older graves. I leaned against the rough bark, gasping for air, my lungs burning. From where I stood, I could see the procession beginning to exit the church. I watched from a distance as 6 pallbearers carried the mahogany casket toward the burial plot prepared on the hill. Serena was there, clinging to Dylan's arm, looking fragile and devastated. They were lowering him into the ground. My father, gone, and with him, my history. My knees felt weak. I slid down the trunk of the oak tree, the wet grass soaking my tights. The words Dylan had said replayed in my mind like a broken record. "You are a ghost." I closed my eyes, ready to let the darkness take me. I was alone. I was bankrupt. I was publicly disgraced. They had won. But then, a sound cut through the noise of the rain and the despair in my head. It was a memory, a sound from 3 weeks ago. It was the sound of my phone ringing at 2 a.m. I opened my eyes, staring at the gray sky. I could hear his voice again, clear as day, cutting through the static of a bad connection and the wheeze of his failing lungs. Luna. I remembered how my hand had shaken when I picked up the phone in my small apartment above the welding shop. I remembered the terror in his voice. Graham Blake did not know terror, but that night, he had been terrified. Don't trust them. Luna. The memory of his voice was the only thing warm in this freezing graveyard. They are lying to you. They are lying to everyone. I watched as the priest threw the first handful of dirt onto the casket. Serena turned away, unable to watch, burying her face in Dylan's shoulder. It looked so real. Find Mr. Green. My father's voice whispered in my memory. He is the only one left. He knows the truth. I wiped the rain from my face. The water felt cold, shocking my system back to life. I stood up, bracing myself against the tree. My legs were steady now. They thought they had buried me today. They thought they had cut me out, shamed me, and sent me back to the gutter they believed I belonged in. They thought the game was over because they held the checkbook and the title. I looked at Serena and Dylan one last time as they got into the lead limousine. They had no idea. I was not here to smell the money. I was here to burn the whole thing down. Find Mr. Green? I whispered to the empty air. I turned my back on the grave and walked into the rain. The memory of my mother dying does not smell like a hospital. It does not smell like medicine or antiseptic or the sterile, lemon-scented cleaner they use to wipe down the floors of the dying. It smells of burnt tomato soup. I was 10 years old. We were in the kitchen of Ravenwood Estate, a cavernous room filled with copper pots that were rarely used and marble countertops that were always too cold to lean against. The staff had the afternoon off. It was just us. My mother had been laughing, trying to teach me how to adjust the flame on the gas range. When she simply stopped, there was no dramatic gasp, no final words of wisdom. She just dropped the wooden spoon. Her hand went to her temple, and she collapsed. The soup boiled over. It hissed as it hit the burner, turning black and acrid, filling the air with a thick, choking smoke that stung my eyes while I screamed into the phone for help. That smell settled into the curtains and the wallpaper, even after the professional cleaners came. Even after the funeral, I could still smell it. There was no abuse after she was gone. My father, Graham Blake, was not a cruel man in the traditional sense. He did not drink himself into a rage or raise his hand to me. He simply vanished. He buried himself in the steel mills of Detroit, leaving before the sun came up and returning long after I was asleep. I was left in that massive, echoing house in Pennsylvania with a rotating cast of nannies, tutors, and housekeepers who were paid to ensure I was fed and educated, but not paid to care if I was happy. I became a ghost in my own home. I would eat dinner alone at a dining table that seated 20 people, the silence pressing against my ears like water. I was not mistreated. I was just forgotten. I was a piece of furniture that had been part of a set, and now that the set was broken, no one knew quite where to put me. 4 months later, the silence was broken by the clicking of high heels on the marble foyer. I was sitting at the top of the grand staircase, my knees pulled up to my chest, sketching in a notebook. The front door opened, and my father walked in. He looked different. He looked awake for the first time since the funeral. And holding his hand was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. Serena. She had a bright red suitcase, a shock of color in our gray world. She wore a camel coat and oversized sunglasses, which she removed slowly to reveal eyes that assessed the value of everything they touched. "Luna," my father said, his voice sounding rusty from disuse. "Come down here. This is Serena." I stood up, clutching my sketchbook to my chest like a shield. Serena looked up at me. She did not smile with her eyes, only with her mouth. It was a practiced expression, the kind politicians use on billboards. "Your father needs new light in this house," she said, her voice smooth and melodious. "We are going to make everything bright again." She did bring light, but it was the harsh, artificial glare of a spotlight, and it was never aimed at me. The erasure happened slowly. First, the portraits of my mother were moved from the hallway to the study, and then from the study to the attic, replaced by modern abstract art that Serena felt was more cosmopolitan. Then, the dinners changed. The table was set for 2, and I was encouraged to eat in the kitchen or my room because the adults had important things to discuss. Then came Dylan. When I was 12 years old, my half-brother was born. My father was ecstatic. He handed out cigars. He stayed home from work for 2 whole weeks. And my playroom, the sunny corner room facing the east garden where I kept my easel and my books, was painted a soft, powdery blue. My things were packed into cardboard boxes and moved to a smaller, north-facing guest room down the hall. "He needs the natural light, Luna," Serena told me, supervising the movers as they carried out my life. "You are a big girl now. You do not need a playroom." I did not cry. I learned early on that tears in the Blake household were viewed as a weakness, a manufacturing defect to be corrected. I watched Dylan grow up from a distance. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets orbiting his gravity. If Dylan sneezed, specialists were flown in. If Dylan wanted a pony, a stable was built. I was well provided for. Certainly, I attended the best boarding schools, wore expensive clothes, and never wanted for material things, but the emotional currency had been devalued to 0. I tried to buy their attention with achievement. When I was 18, I graduated valedictorian of my prep school class. I brought the diploma home, leaving it on the mahogany desk in my father's study. Serena saw it first. She glanced at the gold seal, took a sip of her Chardonnay, and said, "That is the minimum a person bearing the name Blake must do. Do not expect a parade for doing what is expected. Luna." My father just nodded, distracted, looking at his phone. "Good work," he muttered. "Now, Dylan, tell us about your tennis match." That was the moment I stopped trying to be their daughter and started trying to be their equal. I went to university and studied metallurgy and business administration, while other heiresses were spending their summers in Ibiza or the French Riviera. I was in Detroit, wearing fire-retardant coveralls and a hard hat. I interned at Northbridge Steel, not in the executive offices, but on the floor. I wanted to understand the beast my father had built. I learned the smell of molten iron, the heat that singes your eyebrows even from 20 feet away, and the specific vibration of the floor when the rolling mills are at full capacity. I worked harder than anyone. I took the double shifts. I fetched coffee for foremen who did not know my last name was on the building. I wanted to be undeniable. By the time I was 26, I had clawed my way up. I was not given a position. I earned it. I was officially appointed to the Strategy and Operations Department. My father, in a rare moment of acknowledgement, gave me a curt nod across the boardroom table when the announcement was made. That nod sustained me for months. But the higher I climbed, the more the air got thin, and the more the view became distorted. I was working late one Tuesday in November. It was raining in Detroit, the water lashing against the glass walls of the 50th floor of Northbridge Tower. The office was empty, save for the cleaning crew vacuuming the carpets down the hall. I was reviewing the quarterly supply chain audits for a project in South America. Something did not add up. There were costs for shipping logistics that were 3 times the market rate. There were invoices from a consulting firm called Apex Horizon, based in the Cayman Islands, for services that were vaguely defined as strategic alignment. I frowned, pulling up the cross-references. I was good at this. I had an eye for patterns. I started digging. I skipped dinner. I skipped sleep. By 4 a.m, I had a map spread out across my desk, not a physical map, but a digital web of deceit. It was a sophisticated laundering scheme. Northbridge was bleeding money. Millions of dollars siphoned off into shell companies that existed only on paper. And when I followed the trail of digital signatures, when I peeled back the layers of corporate obfuscation, 2 names stared back at me. Serena Vale Blake, acting as Director of Communications and Shareholder Relations, and Dylan Vale, listed as the primary beneficiary of a trust that held the controlling shares of Apex Horizon. My stomach turned over. This was not just greed. This was theft. They were stealing from the company my father had built with his bare hands. They were hollowing out the empire from the inside. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, trembling. I had to tell him. I believed, with a naive and desperate heart, that Graham Blake did not know. He was a hard man, a ruthless businessman, but he preached integrity. He fired people for stealing office supplies. Surely, he would not abide this. I spent the next day compiling the dossier. I printed everything. I wanted physical proof, something that could not be deleted or corrupted. At 6 p.m, I walked to his corner office. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Father," I said, pushing open the heavy glass doors. He was behind his desk, looking tired. The lines around his eyes were deep. Serena was there, too. She was pouring him a drink from the crystal decanter on the sidebar. She froze when she saw the stack of files in my arms. "Luna," my father said, rubbing his temples. "I am tired. Can this wait?" "No," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "It cannot wait. It is about the company. It is about the future of Northbridge." I walked over and slammed the file down on his desk. "Someone is stealing from us. Millions of dollars, funneled into offshore accounts." My father looked at the file, then at me. He did not open it immediately. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "Look at the signatures," I urged him. "Look at the beneficiaries." Serena walked over slowly. She did not look panicked. She looked dangerous. She placed a hand on my father's shoulder. "Graham, darling, I think I know what this is." "You do?" I shot back. "I bet you do." "Luna has been struggling," Serena said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "She has been accessing restricted files. Security notified me yesterday. I did not want to worry you." "That is a lie," I said, my voice rising. "I found fraud. Your fraud." "She is confused, Graham," Serena continued, looking at him with wide, pleading eyes. "She has been trying to frame Dylan. She is jealous. She has always been jealous of him. She stole confidential trade secrets and is trying to leverage them to push us out." "Read the papers," I screamed, losing my composure. "Just read them. Father, it is all there." My father looked at the stack of papers. Then he looked at Serena. Then he looked at me. I saw the struggle in his eyes. I saw the doubt. But I also saw the exhaustion. He was an old man, and Serena was his world. Dylan was his golden boy. I was the reminder of the wife who died. The soup that burned. The silence he hated. Serena leaned down and whispered something in his ear. I did not hear it. but I saw his jaw tighten. He stood up. He picked up the heavy file I had spent 24 hours compiling. He did not open it. He dropped it into the waste bin beside his desk. "Father," I whispered, the blood draining from my face. "How dare you?" he said, his voice low and shaking. "How dare you come into my office and accuse your family of being criminals? They are criminals," I shouted. "And if you do not see it, you are a fool." The slap came out of nowhere. It was not a heavy blow, but the shock of it was like a thunderclap in the room. My head snapped to the side. My cheek burned. I was 26 years old, a grown woman, a senior strategist, and my father had just struck me across the face. The room went dead silent. My father looked at his hand, his eyes wide, as if it belonged to someone else. He looked horrified, but the anger was still there, fueled by Serena's poison. "Get out," he whispered. "Graham." Serena started, placing a hand on his arm, playing the peacemaker now that the war was won. "I said get out," he roared, looking at me. "You are fired. You are done. Security will escort you out." I touched my cheek. It was hot. Tears pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You are making a mistake," I said, my voice trembling. "The only mistake I made," my father said, turning his back to me to look out the window at the rain-soaked city, "was thinking you were one of us. From this moment on, you are no longer my daughter. You are a stranger." I looked at Serena. She was watching me over my father's shoulder. She did not smirk. She did not smile. She just looked at me with a cold, blank indifference, like I was an insect she had just crushed and was already forgetting. I turned around and walked out of the office. I walked past the secretary who was pretending to type, past the glass elevators, and down the hall. I did not take the elevator. I took the stairs, 50 flights of stairs. By the time I reached the lobby, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand, but I had left the crying girl on the 50th floor. I walked out of Northbridge Tower and into the Detroit rain, leaving my career, my inheritance, and my father behind. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the stinging red mark on my cheek, but as I walked, I made a promise to myself. I would not break. I would not fade away. They wanted me gone, but steel is forged in fire, and they had just thrown me into the furnace. I drove until the gaslight on my dashboard screamed at me, and then I drove 10 miles more. I did not have a plan. I only had a direction, which was away. Away from the steel tower that scratched the sky in Detroit, away from the suffocating silence of Ravenwood Estate, and away from the stinging memory of my father's hand across my face. I ended up in a coastal town in Maine where the air smelled of salt brine and rotting kelp, a scent so thick you could taste it on your tongue. It was the antithesis of the sterile, air-conditioned executive suites I had spent my 20s inhabiting. Here, the wind whipped my hair into a tangled mess, and the fog rolled in thick and heavy, erasing the world every morning. I rented a room above a bakery that smelled perpetually of yeast and burnt sugar. I had a few $1,000s in a checking account that Serena had not been able to freeze, but I knew it would not last long. I needed to work, but I could not go back to a boardroom. The thought of putting on a blazer, of sitting in a meeting discussing profit margins and synergy, made me physically ill. I wanted to do something real. I wanted to touch something that did not lie. I found work at a grimy garage on the outskirts of town, a place called Sal's Auto and Welding. Sal was a man made of grease and grunts, with hands that looked like catcher's mitts. He looked at my resume, which detailed my dual degrees and my years as a corporate strategist, and then he looked at my manicured hands. "I do not need a strategist," Sal had said, spitting tobacco juice into a styrofoam cup. "I need someone who can fix the rusted axle on a '99 Ford without crying about a broken nail." "I can weld," I told him. "I know the melting point of every alloy in this shop. I know how to lay a bead that will hold 10 tons of pressure." He threw a welding mask at me. "Prove it." I did. I put on the heavy gloves, pulled the mask down, and sparked the torch. For the first time in my life, the smell of ozone and burning metal did not remind me of my father's empire. It reminded me of survival. I fixed the axle. It was ugly work, dirty and hot, but the weld was perfect. Sal hired me on the spot for $15 an hour. That was how I disappeared. Luna Blake, heiress to the Northbridge fortune, ceased to exist. In her place stood Luna Flores, the quiet woman in the coveralls who could fix anything made of metal. The first few months were brutal. I would come home with burns on my forearms and grease permanently etched into my cuticles. My back ached, and my ears rang from the sound of grinders and hammers, but there was a strange, heavy peace in the exhaustion. When I slept, I did not dream of stock tickers or Serena's cold smile. I slept the sleep of the dead. I learned to use my knowledge of steel not to manipulate markets, but to keep a fisherman's truck running for another winter season. I learned that steel was honest. If you heated it right, if you treated it with respect, it held. If you rushed it, if you were careless, it broke. It was a simple morality that my family had long forgotten. 5 years later, I had saved enough to open my own shop. I found an old boat shed right on the water's edge, a drafty building with peeling paint and a leaking roof. I fixed it up myself. I painted the sign by hand, Harborline Fabrication. I stopped fixing trucks and started making things. I built custom iron railings for the summer cottages on the cliffs. I designed steel-framed tables for the hipster cafes popping up in the tourist district. I welded custom frames for lobster traps that could withstand the brutal Atlantic storms. I moved into a small rental house a mile down the coast. It was nothing like Ravenwood. The floors were warped pine. The windows rattled when the wind blew, and the heating system was a cranky wood stove in the living room. But I loved it. I loved waking up to the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks instead of the silence of a mansion. I loved making my own coffee in a chipped mug, standing on my porch, watching the sun struggle through the mist. It was a small life, a quiet life, and it was entirely mine. Then I met Eli. Eli Turner was a boat designer who smelled like cedar shavings and rain. He came into my shop on a Tuesday morning dragging a piece of twisted metal that looked like it had been chewed by a shark. "They told me you are the wizard of metal," he said, dumping the piece on my workbench. "This is the rudder linkage for a trawler I'm refitting. Can you save it, or do I have to wait 6 weeks for a part from Germany?" I looked at the metal. It was high-grade stainless steel, but it had sheared under stress. "I can fix it," I said, running my thumb over the fracture. "But it will cost you a dinner." I do not know why I said it. I had kept to myself for years, building a wall as high and thick as the ones around Ravenwood, but there was something about his eyes. They were kind. They were open. He did not look at me and see a tragedy or a bank account. He just saw a woman with soot on her cheek and a welding torch in her hand. Eli did not care about the name Blake. When I finally told him, 6 months later, while we were sitting on the floor of my living room eating takeout pizza, he just shrugged. "So your dad made steel," he said, picking a pepperoni off his slice. "You make steel, too. You just make better stuff with it." That was it. No questions about the money, no hunger for the connections. He just loved me. We moved in together a year later. We adopted a rescue dog, a scruffy terrier mix with one ear that stood up and one that flopped over, whom we named Sparky. Our house became a home filled with noise. It was filled with the sound of Eli sketching at his drafting table, the sound of Sparky barking at seagulls, the sound of us laughing over burnt toast on Sunday mornings. I found a rhythm that soothed the jagged edges of my soul. I would wake up, drink my coffee, kiss Eli goodbye, drive to the shop, and create. I made beautiful things. I made sturdy things. I made things that people needed. I was not moving numbers on a screen. I was bending the world with my hands. We never talked about having children, not seriously, but sometimes, when I watched Eli playing fetch with Sparky on the beach, throwing the ball with that easy, loping grace, I would think about it. I would tell myself that if I ever brought a child into this world, they would never know the coldness I had known. They would never walk into a room and feel like an accessory. They would grow up in a house that was small but full, loud with love, warm with the heat of a wood stove and the smell of cedar and iron. They would never be left behind. But the past is a patient predator. It waits. I tried to ignore it, but the world is small, and Northbridge Steel was big. Every now and then, I would be at the local pub with Eli and his friends, nursing a beer after a long week, and the news would flash on the TV above the bar. Northbridge Steel acquires rival firm in hostile takeover. Graham Blake announces record profits for third quarter. Dylan Vale spotted at charity gala in New York with starlet. I would see my father's face, older now, grayer, his eyes looking hollow despite the smile he plastered on for the cameras. I would see Dylan, preening in his tuxedo, looking like a king who had never fought a battle. I would see Serena, always just behind them, the architect of the image, looking ageless and terrifyingly perfect. Whenever that happened, the laughter in my throat would die. I would go cold. I would mute the TV in my mind, staring at the screen until the image burned into my retinas. My hand would grip my beer glass so hard, I was surprised it did not shatter. Luna, Eli would ask, touching my arm gently, "You okay?" "I am fine," I would say, forcing a smile that felt tight and brittle. "Just tired, long week at the shop." I told myself I was over it. I told myself the wound had scabbed over. I had a life. I had love. I had dignity. I did not need them. I did not need their money or their approval. I was free. But you are never really free of your parents, are you? They are the landscape in which you are built. You can move to a different country. You can change your name. You can scrub your skin raw. But they are in your blood. It all came crashing down on a Thursday in November. It was storming. A classic Maine nor'easter was battering the coast, the wind howling around the eaves of our little house like a banshee. The rain was lashing against the windows in sheets. Eli was asleep beside me, his breathing deep and rhythmic, an anchor in the chaos of the storm. Sparky was curled up at the foot of the bed, twitching in his sleep. I was awake. I had been staring at the ceiling for hours, listening to the storm, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread tightening in my chest. It felt like the barometric pressure was dropping not just outside, but inside my ribs. Then, the phone rang. It was on the nightstand. The screen lit up the dark room with a harsh, blue glow. I frowned. It was 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. No one called at 2 in the morning unless someone was dead or dying. I reached out and picked it up. The number was blocked. Unknown caller. My heart skipped a beat. A cold prickle of intuition ran down my spine. I should not answer it. I should let it go to voicemail. I should roll over and hug Eli and go back to sleep. But my thumb hovered over the green button. I knew. Somehow, deep in the marrow of my bones, I knew. I slid the button and brought the phone to my ear. I did not speak. I just listened to the static, the crackle of a bad connection, the sound of someone breathing heavily on the other end. It was a wet, ragged sound, like air being forced through a broken machine. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind outside. There was a pause, a long, agonizing silence where the only sound was the wheezing breath. "Luna," a voice rasped. The world stopped. The storm outside ceased to exist. The bed beneath me vanished. It was a voice I had not heard in 8 years. It was a voice I had tried to exorcise from my memory. But it was different now. It was weak. It was broken. It lacked the thunderous authority of the CEO who had banished me. It sounded small. It sounded terrified. "Luna," the voice said again, followed by a coughing fit that sounded painful and deep. "Daughter, is it you?" I sat up in bed, clutching the sheet to my chest. My hand was shaking so hard the phone rattled against my ear. "Father," I choked out. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like a stone I had swallowed. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent and slurred, as if he was fighting against a fog of drugs. "I do not have much time. They are watching." "Who?" I asked, my voice rising. Eli stirred beside me, grumbling in his sleep. "Serena," my father gasped. "Dylan, do not trust them. Luna, Do not believe anything they say. Father, where are you? I demanded, panic rising in my throat like bile. Are you at the hospital I saw on the news? Home. He cut me off. I am at Ravenwood. They brought me home to die. Luna. But it is not. It is not right. What do you mean? I was wrong, he whispered, and the sound of him crying, actually crying, broke something inside me that I did not know was still whole. I was so wrong about everything, about you. Father, please, I said, tears hot on my face. Let me call the police. Let me call a doctor. No, he hissed. No police. She owns them. She owns everyone. The line crackled. I heard a door open in the background on his end. I heard heavy footsteps. Find Green, my father said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Find Alistair Green. He has it. He knows. Mr. Green. The butler, I asked, confused. He retired years ago. He knows the truth, my father said. He is hiding. He is hiding the fire. Luna, it will burn them. It will burn everything down. Father, I am sorry, he said, his voice fading. My little moon, I am so sorry. There was a scuffling sound on the line, a sharp click, and then the dial tone. I sat there in the dark, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the drone of the dead line. The storm howled outside, rattling the window panes, but the storm inside me was violent enough to tear the house apart. Eli sat up, blinking sleep from his eyes. He saw my face in the blue light of the phone screen. Luna, he asked, his voice thick with sleep. Babe, what is it? Who was that? I lowered the phone slowly. I looked at him, but I did not see him. I saw the rain-slicked streets of Detroit. I saw the iron gates of Ravenwood. I saw the face of the man who had cast me out, begging for salvation. My father, I whispered. Eli looked confused. Your father, Graham? I stood up. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour. The peace I had built, the quiet life by the sea, the smell of cedar and salt, it all shattered like glass. He is in trouble, I said, moving toward the closet, grabbing my jeans. They are doing something to him. Luna. Wait, Eli said, getting out of bed. Slow down. What did he say? He said he was wrong, I said, pulling on my boots. He said, find Mr. Green. I grabbed my coat. I grabbed my keys. Where are you going? Eli asked, grabbing my arm gently. It is 2 a.m. It is a hurricane out there. I looked at him. I loved him. I loved this life, but I knew, in that moment, that I could not keep it. Not tonight. I have to go back, I said, my voice hard as the steel I worked with every day. I have to go home. I walked out into the storm, leaving the warmth of the only real home I had ever known, and drove back toward the darkness I had spent a decade trying to outrun. Do not trust Serena. Do not trust Dylan. Find Mr. Green. He has the truth. I was wrong. Those were the last words my father spoke to me. They were not delivered with the booming, authoritative baritone that had once commanded boardrooms and silenced union strikes. They were wheezed, broken fragments of sound, wet with fluid and heavy with regret. And then, there was a sharp, mechanical click. The line went dead. It was not a gradual fade. It was instantaneous, as if someone had physically yanked the cord from the wall. I sat there in the dark, the phone pressed so hard against my ear that it hurt, listening to the hollow drone of the dial tone. Father. I screamed into the void. Dad. My thumb scrambled over the screen, hitting the redial button. My heart was hammering against my ribcage, a frantic, irregular rhythm that made my vision blur. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Pick up. I begged silently. Please, just pick up. It went to voicemail. The automated voice was his, recorded years ago, strong and impatient. "You have reached Graham Blake. Leave a message." I hung up and dialed again. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped the device. This time, it did not even ring. It went straight to the operator message telling me the subscriber was unavailable. They had turned it off, or they had smashed it. I sat frozen on the edge of the bed. The silence of the room rushing back in to fill the space where his voice had been. The storm outside was still raging, rain lashing against the shingles, but I could only hear the blood rushing in my ears. Eli shifted behind me, sitting up and rubbing his face. "Luna. What is happening? Who was on the phone?" I turned to look at him, but I could not focus. My mouth opened, but no words came out. How could I explain that the ghost I had spent 8 years burying had just reached out from the grave? How could I explain that the man who had disowned me was now begging for my help? "I have to go." I managed to choke out finally. "Go where?" Eli asked, reaching for the lamp. The yellow light flooded the room, stinging my eyes. "It is 2 a.m. The roads are flooded." "He is dying, Eli," I said, standing up and grabbing my jeans from the chair. I struggled to pull them on, my balance gone. "He is dying, and they are doing something to him." "Who?" "My family." I spat the word out like a curse. I did not wait for him to argue. I grabbed my keys and my coat. I ran out into the rain, the cold water soaking me instantly, and jumped into my truck. The engine roared to life, a rough, reliable sound that usually comforted me. Tonight, it just sounded like a getaway vehicle. I drove like a madwoman. The journey from our coastal town to Ravenwood Estate usually took 6 hours. I made it in 4. I tore down the interstate, the speedometer climbing past 80, 90, 100 miles an hour. The rain was a wall of silver in my headlights. Hydroplaning on the curves. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles were white, terrified that if I slowed down, even for a second, I would be too late. "Find Mr. Green." The name bounced around my skull. Alistair Green, the butler who had dried my tears when my mother died, the man who had sneaked me extra desserts when Serena put me on a diet. He had been fired years ago, or so I heard. Why would he have the truth? What truth? By the time I reached the iron gates of Ravenwood, the sky was a bruised purple of early dawn. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, and a thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around the tires as I skidded to a halt. The estate looked different. The wrought iron gates I remembered were open and welcoming during the day, closed only at night. Now, they looked like the entrance to a fortress. There were cameras mounted on the stone pillars, red lights blinking in the gloom, tracking my truck as I idled. A new security booth had been built just inside the perimeter, reinforced with dark glass. I slammed the truck into park and jumped out. The air was freezing. "Open the gate," I shouted, running toward the intercom. The heavy iron gates were slightly ajar, just a crack, but before I could push through, 2 men stepped out from the shadows of the guard booth. They were not the old groundskeepers I remembered. These men were large, wearing tactical vests and earpieces. They looked like private military contractors, not estate security. One of them stepped in front of me, blocking my path with a wall of muscle. "Private property, ma'am," he rumbled, his voice flat. "Turn around." "I am Luna Blake," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. "Graham Blake is my father. I need to see him." The guard did not blink. He did not check a clipboard. He did not radio up to the house. He just crossed his arms. "We have strict instructions. No visitors, especially not you." "He called me," I yelled, trying to shove past him, but it was like trying to move a mountain. "He called me 3 hours ago. Get out of my way." "You are not on the list," the second guard said, stepping up to support the first. "Leave now, or we will remove you." I looked past them, up the long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. I could see the house in the distance, a massive stone structure looming in the mist. Most of the windows were dark, but there was a light on in the master bedroom on the second floor, my father's room. "Please, I said, my anger breaking into desperation. Just 5 minutes. I just want to see him. I just want to know he is alive. The front door of the mansion opened. It was far away, but the figure that stepped out onto the limestone portico was unmistakable. Serena. She walked down the steps, not rushing, moving with the languid grace of a predator that has already caught its prey. She was wearing a black silk dressing gown that trailed behind her on the wet stones. She wore no makeup. Her face was pale, stripped of the layers of foundation she usually wore for the cameras, but her eyes were sharp, glittering like obsidian in the gray light. She stopped 10 feet away from the gate, safely behind the wall of guards. "You look terrible, Luna," she said. Her voice was calm, carrying easily through the damp air, though I suppose grease and poverty do that to a person. "Where is he?" I demanded, gripping the iron bars of the gate. "Let me see him." "Serena." She sighed, pulling her silk robe tighter around her throat. "He is resting. He is very tired. Luna, the doctors say he needs absolute quiet. Agitation is bad for his heart." "He called me," I said, staring straight into her eyes. "He told me not to trust you." Serena did not flinch. A small, pitying smile touched her lips. "The dementia has been aggressive lately. He gets confused. He thinks he is living in the past. He thinks he has a daughter who loves him, instead of a traitor who tried to destroy his legacy." "You are lying," I hissed. "I heard him. He was lucid." "He does not want to see you," Serena said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming hard and cold as steel. "He explicitly asked us to keep you away. He remembers what you did. He remembers the files you stole. He remembers the shame." "Let me hear him say that," I challenged her. "Go home," Serena said, her tone shifting again, now dripping with faux sweetness. "Go back to your little welding shop on the coast. Go back to your mechanic boyfriend. You have a new life, don't you? Why come back here and disturb a dying man?" I froze. I had never told anyone about the shop. I had never told anyone about Eli. "You have been watching me," I whispered. Serena just smiled. Then, movement on the balcony above drew my eye. Dylan walked out. He was wearing pajama bottoms and a cashmere sweater, holding a coffee mug in one hand and his smartphone in the other. He leaned casually against the stone railing, looking down at me like I was a stray dog barking at the fence. He raised his phone. He was recording me. "Look at her," Dylan called down, his voice loud and mocking. "The prodigal daughter returns. Did you run out of cash? Luna, did the scrap metal business dry up?" "Dylan, let me in," I said, my voice breaking. "He is your father, too." "He chose his family," Dylan said, zooming in with his camera. I could see the red dot recording. "He chose the people who stayed. You are just a stain on the past. Luna, a mistake he corrected a long time ago." He laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Smile for the camera. Sis, I want the shareholders to see exactly how desperate you look." I looked from Dylan to Serena, and then past them, toward the open window of my father's room. The wind shifted, blowing from the house toward me. And in that breeze, I smelled it. It was not the smell of home. It was not the smell of old wood and beeswax and rain. It was the smell of bleach, strong, industrial-grade chlorine. The smell of a hospital sterilization room, and beneath that, the faint, sickly sweet odor of decay. There was something else missing. The house was silent. Usually, at this hour, the kitchen staff would be arriving, the gardeners would be starting their rounds. There was no one. The windows were dark. The chimneys were cold. It was a tomb. "He is in there alone, isn't he?" I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You fired everyone. You isolated him." Serena's eyes narrowed. "Escort her off the property," she commanded the guards. "If she returns, arrest her for trespassing." The guard shoved me back. His hand was heavy on my shoulder, pushing me toward my truck. "You will pay for this," I screamed, fighting against his grip. "If you hurt him, I swear to God." "Serena, I will burn this whole place to the ground." "You have nothing to burn us with," Serena said, turning her back on me. "You are nothing." She walked back into the house and the heavy oak door slammed shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Dylan lingered on the balcony for a second longer, gave me a final, sarcastic wave, and disappeared inside. I was shoved back against the door of my truck. The guard loomed over me, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. "Go, now!" I scrambled into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so hard I could barely put the key in the ignition. I locked the doors. I stared at the house one last time. It looked impenetrable. It looked evil. I threw the truck into reverse and spun the tires on the wet gravel, speeding away down the long, tree-lined drive. I did not stop until I was 3 miles away, pulled over on the shoulder of the highway, hidden by a dense line of pines. I killed the engine. I gripped the steering wheel and screamed until my throat was raw, pounding my fists against the dashboard until they ached. I was helpless. They had the walls, the guards, the money, and the law. I was just a welder in dirty jeans. But then, the silence returned, and in the silence, the mantra began. "Find Mr. Green." My father knew. He knew I could not get in. He knew they would stop me. That was why he gave me a name. Mr. Green. Alistair Green. He had been the head butler for 40 years. He knew every secret, every hidden safe, every skeleton in the Blake closet. I wiped the tears from my face with the back of my gritty hand. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out my burner phone, a habit from my days investigating the company fraud. I needed help. I needed someone who could find a ghost. I dialed a number I had not called since college. "Noah," I whispered when the line connected, my voice steadying into a cold, hard resolve. "It is Luna. I need you to find someone, and I need you to do it today." The game had changed. I was not the daughter begging at the gate anymore. I was the hunter. And I was going to find the weapon my father had hidden for me. 3 days after the guards shoved me away from the gates of Ravenwood Estate, my phone rang again. It was not a block number this time. It was the official line of Craig Mortimer, the senior partner at Mortimer, Finch, and Sterling, the legal firm that had represented the personal interests of the Blake family since before I was born. His voice was dry and devoid of any human warmth, sounding exactly like the rustling of expensive parchment. He did not offer condolences. He simply issued a summons. I was required to present myself at the Northbridge Tower in Detroit at 10 in the morning the following day for the reading of the last will and testament of Graham Blake. I stood in the kitchen of my small house, gripping the countertop. The storm had passed, leaving the main sky a bruised and innocent blue, but the turbulence inside me had not settled. I had spent the last 72 hours in a state of manic, quiet intensity. I had spoken to Noah Ramirez, my old college friend turned private investigator. Noah was the kind of man who could find a needle in a haystack. Provided the haystack was digital and the needle had a credit history. "It is tight, Luna," Noah had told me, his voice crackling over the speakerphone while I paced the floorboards. "The estate is on total lockdown, but I dug into the employment records. The entire household staff was terminated 2 months ago. Gardeners, cooks, maids, all of them, replaced by a private security firm called Ironclad Solutions, and Graham's personal physician, Dr. Aris. He was fired 6 weeks ago for professional misconduct that was never specified. Serena brought in a concierge doctor who was on her payroll. They isolated him," I had whispered, feeling the cold truth settle in my stomach. "They cut the lines. It looks that way," Noah had confirmed. "I am still looking for Alistair Green. The old butler is a ghost. No social media, no credit cards, nothing since he left employment. But I will find him. You just handle the sharks in Detroit." Now, I had to face them. I did not tell Eli the whole truth. I could not. He was a man of simple, sturdy morals. If he knew I was walking into a den of thieves who had essentially held my father prisoner, he would have insisted on coming with me. He would have wanted to protect me. But this was not a situation that could be solved with a wrench or a fist. This required a scalpel. I have to go to Detroit. I told him that morning as I packed a small bag. I pulled out the only suit I had kept from my old life, a charcoal gray ensemble that was sharp enough to cut glass. A big client. A hotel chain wants custom ironwork for their lobby. Eli was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing his coffee. He watched me button the blazer. He watched me smooth back my hair, pinning it into a severe style that was miles away from the wind-blown look he knew. He did not buy it. I could see it in his eyes. He knew I was lying about the client, but he also knew I was going to a funeral of sorts. He stood up and walked over to me. He did not ask me to stay. He wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He smelled of sawdust and safety. "Luna," he said softly, his hands resting on my waist. "I do not know what is waiting for you in that city, but do not let them drag you back. Do not let them make you into someone you hate. You are Luna Flores. You build things. You are real. Remember that." "I will," I promised, my voice tight. I kissed him goodbye and walked out the door, feeling like a soldier marching toward a war she had already lost once. The drive to Detroit was a blur. The city rose up from the horizon like a jagged set of teeth, gray and imposing. Northbridge Tower stood in the center, a monolith of black glass and steel that reflected the clouds. It was the tallest building in the state, a monument to my father's ego and ambition. I used to love this building. I used to think it was beautiful. Now, it just looked like a tombstone. I parked in the visitor lot, ignoring the valet. I walked through the lobby, the sound of my heels clicking on the marble floor echoing the beat of my heart. The security guards at the desk did not recognize me. I was just another suit, another woman with a briefcase, another cog in the machine. I took the elevator to the 60th floor. My ears popped as the car ascended. I watched the numbers climb 10, 20, 30, 40, at 50. The doors did not open, but I felt a phantom pain in my cheek where my father had slapped me 8 years ago. The elevator continued up, sealing me in. When the doors slid open on the 60th floor, the air hit me. It was freezing. They always kept the executive level at a sub-zero temperature, a power move designed to keep people alert and uncomfortable. The conference room was at the end of the long hallway, a glass-walled aquarium that offered a panoramic view of the city my father had practically owned. I walked in. The room was exactly as I remembered it, yet entirely foreign. The table was a slab of polished black granite that seemed to stretch for miles. Serena sat at the head of the table. She looked immaculate. She wore a navy blue suit that cost more than my truck. Her hair coiffed into a helmet of perfection. She did not look like a grieving widow. She looked like a CEO waiting for a quarterly report. To her right sat Dylan. He was slouching slightly, spinning a gold pen between his fingers. He wore a black suit, but his tie was loosened, a subtle sign of disrespect. To her left sat Craig Mortimer. He was a small man with nervous eyes and a suit that seemed slightly too large for him. He was shuffling papers, his hands trembling just enough to be noticeable. And there was one empty chair. It was at the complete opposite end of the table, 20 feet away from them. The distance was not accidental. It was a statement. We are here. You are there. We are the family. You are the outsider. I walked to the chair and sat down. I did not say hello. I placed my hands on the cold table and looked at them. "Well," Dylan said, breaking the silence. His voice was laced with that familiar, toxic amusement. "Look who decided to show up. Welcome to the show. Luna, I hope you did not expect refreshments. We are not serving handouts today." "Dylan," Serena said. It was not a scold. It was a command. She looked at me, her lips curving into a smile that did not reach her eyes. It was the smile of a scientist observing a lab rat. "Thank you for coming. Luna, I know it must be difficult for you to be in this building again, given the circumstances of your departure." "I am here for my father," I said, my voice steady. "Let us get this over with." Craig Mortimer cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Yes, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. We are here to read the last will and testament of Graham Alexander Blake. This document was executed 6 months ago, superseding all previous drafts. He picked up the heavy document, the paper crinkling. I, Graham Blake, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will. Mortimer began. The legalese washed over me. I stared at the city skyline through the glass, listening to the dismantling of an empire. To my devoted wife, Serena Vale Blake, Mortimer read, who stood by my side through the darkest storms and provided me with the only true home I have ever known. I leave the controlling interest in Northbridge Steel Group, consisting of 65% of all voting shares. Dillon smirked, tapping his pen against the table. Additionally, Mortimer continued, I bequeath to Serena the properties in Lake Tahoe, the penthouse in Manhattan, and the estate in Savannah. Blink. 65%. It was a kingdom. To my son, Dillon Vale, Mortimer said, and Dillon sat up straighter. I leave 35% of the voting shares in Northbridge Steel, along with the title to the Ravenwood estate and the property in Santa Fe, with the hope that he will carry the Blake legacy into the future. That was it. 100% of the company, gone, divided between the woman who had manipulated him and the boy who had mocked him. Mortimer paused. He looked up from the paper, his eyes darting toward me and then quickly away. He licked his lips nervously. And regarding my daughter, Luna Flores, he read. The room went dead silent. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. For my daughter, Luna, Mortimer read, his voice dropping a little, who chose to separate herself from this family and who, by her own actions, sought to damage the reputation and stability of this company. I dug my fingernails into my palms under the table. I leave nothing, Mortimer read. It is my wish that she continues to live the life she has chosen. Without the burden of the wealth she so clearly despised, I leave her only with the hope that she finds peace in the obscurity she sought. Mortimer lowered the paper. For a second, no one moved. Then, Dillon threw his head back and laughed. It was a barking, ugly sound. Obscurity, Dillon crowed, slamming his hand on the table. God, the old man really knew how to twist the knife, didn't he? The burden of wealth, that is poetry. Did you hear that? Luna, he did you a favor. He saved you from the burden. I sat there, stunned. It was not the money. I did not care about the money. I had built a life without it. I had been happy without it. It was the words, who sought to damage the reputation. The burden of wealth she despised. These were not my father's words. I closed my eyes, and I heard the voice on the phone again. The voice from 3 nights ago. Luna, I was wrong. Don't trust them. Find Mr. Green. The man who wrote this will hated me. The man on the phone loved me. The man who wrote this will sounded arrogant and cold. The man on the phone sounded broken and desperate. They were 2 different men, and that meant only one thing. The will was a lie. I opened my eyes. I did not cry. The shock that had initially paralyzed me was rapidly cooling into a hard, crystallized rage. I looked down the long expanse of the granite table. Serena was watching me. She was not laughing like Dillon. She was studying me, waiting for the outburst, waiting for the tears, waiting for the confirmation that she had finally truly crushed me. He was very clear, Serena said softly. He was heartbroken. Luna, until the very end, he could never understand why you turned against us. 6 months ago, I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through Dillon's laughter like a razor. Dillon stopped laughing. What? The will, I said, looking at Mortimer. You said it was executed 6 months ago. Yes, Mortimer stammered. That is correct. Witnessed and notarized. 6 months ago, I repeated. When he was already sick, when you had already fired his doctor, when you had already changed the security codes. He was perfectly lucid, Serena said sharply. Dr. Evans certified his competency. Dr. Evans, I said, testing the name. The concierge doctor you hired. You are grasping at straws, Serena said, her eyes narrowing into slits. It is over, Luna. He chose. You removed yourself from this family the day you tried to frame us for fraud. You touched things you did not understand, and you got burned, and now you are just ash. She stood up. It was a dismissal. The reading is concluded, Serena said. Craig, give her a copy of the document. Security will escort her out. Dylan stood up, buttoning his jacket. Better luck in the next life. Sis, try not to weld anything important. They turned their backs on me. They began to talk about a lunch reservation at the London Chop House, as if they had not just erased a human being from existence. I stood up. My legs felt solid. My hands were steady. You are right, Serena, I said. She stopped and turned halfway around, looking bored. Excuse me. I did touch things I did not understand back then, I said, picking up the copy of the will that Mortimer had slid toward me. I was young. I thought the truth mattered to him. I looked at the document in my hand. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was shaky. It looked forced. But I understand now, I said. Good, Serena said coldly. Then leave. I walked to the door. I did not look back at them. I walked out of the conference room, down the long hallway, and pressed the button for the elevator. As the doors slid open and I stepped inside, I saw their reflection in the glass wall of the conference room. They were clinking glasses of water, celebrating. They thought it was over. They thought the piece of paper in my hand was a shield that would protect them forever. The elevator doors closed, cutting off the view of the 60th floor. I stared at my own reflection in the polished steel doors. I saw a woman in a gray suit, but beneath the fabric, I saw the welder. I saw the woman who knew that if you applied enough heat, even the hardest steel would melt. The man on the phone had said I was wrong. The will said she was wrong. One of them was the truth, and Graham Blake was not a man who stuttered. He didn't write this, I whispered to the empty elevator car. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, but it did not knock me down. It held me up. If the will was a lie, then the real one was out there. Find Mr. Green. My father had not just left me a warning. He had left me a map. The elevator dinged at the lobby level. The doors opened, and I stepped out into the busy atrium of Northbridge Tower. I did not feel buried. I did not feel dead. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Noah. Noah, I said, walking through the revolving doors and out into the sunlight. Forget the background checks. I need an address. I am coming to Ohio. You found something? Noah asked. I found a lie, I said, gripping the phone tight, and I am going to use it to hang them. The address Noah Ramirez sent me led to a place that felt like it belonged on a different planet than the steel and glass canyons of Detroit. It was a small, weather-beaten cottage sitting on the edge of a quiet lake in Ohio, tucked away at the end of a gravel road that crunched loudly under the tires of my truck. The air here smelled of pine needles and wood smoke, a sharp, clean scent that cleared the city's smog from my lungs. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It was humble. The porch leaned slightly to the left, and the paint was peeling in spots, revealing the gray wood underneath. There was a rocking chair on the porch, with a plaid blanket thrown over the back, suggesting a life of slow, quiet contemplation. I stepped out of the truck, my boots sinking into the soft earth. My heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was about to meet the past face to face. I walked up the steps and knocked on the door. I did not have to wait long. The door opened, and there stood Alistair Green. I remembered him as a giant, in my childhood at Ravenwood. Mr. Green had been the keeper of the keys, the man who stood 6 feet tall in his impeccable suit, managing the chaos of the Blake household with a raised eyebrow and a dry wit. Now, he seemed to have shrunk. His back was bowed, curved by the weight of years and gravity. His hair, once a distinguished salt and pepper, was now entirely white, thinning at the temples. He wore a thick wool cardigan over a flannel shirt, looking more like a retired fisherman than the butler to a billionaire. But his eyes were the same. They were a piercing, intelligent blue, undimmed by age. He looked at me. He did not smile, but his expression softened, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You took longer than I thought you would. Little girl," he said. His voice was rougher than I remembered, scratching like sandpaper, but the warmth was still there. "Mr. Green," I said, my voice catching in my throat. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "It is cold, and the kettle is just boiling." The inside of the cottage was small, essentially one large room with a kitchenette in the corner and a stone fireplace that took up most of the far wall. A fire was crackling in the hearth, casting a golden, dancing light over the room. It was cluttered, but in a way that felt comfortable, not messy. There were stacks of books on the floor, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, and the smell of cinnamon and old paper hung in the air. But what stopped me dead in my tracks were the photographs. They were everywhere, covering the mantelpiece, hanging on the walls, tucked into the frames of the mirror, and they were all of us. There was a photo of me at 5 years old, missing a front tooth, holding a muddy frog in the garden at Ravenwood. There was a picture of my mother, laughing, her hair windblown, and there were dozens of photos of my father, not the Graham Blake of the magazines, scowling in a suit, but the Graham Blake I had almost forgotten. Graham rolling up his sleeves to fix a bicycle, Graham asleep in a hammock, Graham holding me when I was a baby, looking at me with a terrifying amount of love. "I kept them," Mr. Green said, shuffling past me to the kitchen. "Serena ordered them all burned. She said they were clutter. I pulled them out of the trash bags before the sanitation truck came." I walked over to the mantelpiece, touching a photo of my father. "He looks happy here." "He was," Mr. Green said, placing a mug of tea on the small wooden table near the fire. "Sit down, Luna. We have a great deal to talk about." I sat in the armchair opposite him. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. I wrapped my hands around the hot mug, needing the warmth. "You were there," I said. At the end, Mr. Green nodded slowly. He took a sip of his tea, his hand trembling slightly. "I was the last one left. She got rid of the others systematically. The cook was fired for stealing silver, which was a lie. The gardener was let go for laziness, another lie. Within 2 months of your father taking to his bed, the entire staff had been replaced." "Replaced by who?" I asked. "Strangers," Green said, his face hardening. "Men with thick necks and earpieces who did not know how to pour tea but knew how to block a doorway. And nurses, not the compassionate kind. They were on her payroll. Luna. They reported to Serena, not the doctor." He leaned forward, the firelight catching the anger in his eyes. "It was a prison," he said softly. "Ravenwood became a prison. She installed cameras in every hallway, in the kitchen, even in his bedroom. She said it was for his safety, to monitor his condition, but it was to monitor his contact." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Noah told me his doctor was fired." "Dr. Aris was a good man," Green confirmed. "He refused to sedate your father when there was no need. So Serena filed a complaint with the medical board and had him removed from the premises. She brought in a new man, a Dr. Evans, who wrote prescriptions as fast as Serena could ask for them." "Tell me about the will," I said. "The lawyer read it yesterday. It said I was cut out. It said I despise the burden of wealth." Mr. Green let out a dry, bitter chuckle. "Your father never wrote those words. That was Serena talking. I heard her say those exact phrases to him." He set his mug down and looked into the fire, his expression distant, as if he were watching a horror movie replay in the flames. "He was weak, Luna. His lungs were failing. He was on a ventilator most of the day. Breathing was a struggle for him, and she used it." "Used what?" "The pain," Green whispered. "The isolation. She would sit by his bed with that document, the new will, the one giving her everything. She would tell him that if he signed it, She would let him watch the news. If he signed it, she would increase the morphine drip so he could sleep. If he did not sign it, Green trailed off, his jaw tightening. If he did not sign it, I pressed. She withheld the medication, Green said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. She would let him lie there in agony, gasping for air, telling him that he was being stubborn. She cut the cable to his television. She told the guards to turn away his old friends who came to visit. She told him everyone had forgotten him. She told him you were laughing at him. My stomach twisted. I felt sick. This was not just manipulation. This was torture. And Dylan? I asked. Did he know? Dylan was worse, Green said. He looked at me, and I saw true disgust in his eyes. Dylan rarely came into the room. He could not stand the smell of sickness. But when he did, it was to demand things. I was polishing the brass handle of the door one afternoon, and the door was cracked open just an inch. I saw him. Green demonstrated with his hand, mimicking a slamming motion. He slammed his hand down on the mattress, right next to your father's leg. Your father jumped. He was terrified. And Dylan screamed at him. He said, "Sign the paper, old man, or just lie there and rot. We are taking the money anyway. Make it easy on yourself." I closed my eyes. Rot. Your father looked at him, Green continued softly, and I think that was the moment the spell broke. Graham had spent his whole life thinking he could buy loyalty. He thought he had bought a family with Serena and Dylan, but in that moment, looking at his son screaming at him to die faster, he realized he had bought nothing but vultures. "So he called me," I said. "That night?" "Yes," Green said. "It was 3 nights before he died. It was storming, much like the night you left all those years ago. Serena had gone out to a charity gala. She wanted to keep up appearances. The night nurse was asleep in the chair in the hallway. I snuck in." Green leaned back, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He was awake. He was crying. He grabbed my hand. "Luna." His grip was so weak, like a bird's claw. He pulled me down and whispered, "I was wrong. Alistair, I was so wrong. They are eating me alive." I wiped a tear from my cheek. "He told me he had written a real will," Green said. "A year ago, before the sickness got bad. He had done it in secret, with a lawyer Serena did not know. He hid it, but he knew he was running out of time. He begged me for a phone. He said he needed to hear your voice." "I heard him," I whispered. "He told me to find you." "I gave him my cell phone," Green said. "I stood guard at the door while he called you. It was the first time I had seen him smile in months. Just hearing you answer, it gave him peace. But then the line went dead," I said. Green's face fell. "Serena came back early. The storm had canceled the gala. She walked in and saw the light under the door. She pushed past me. She saw him with the phone." He shook his head. "She did not hear what he said. I do not think, but she knew he was reaching out. She snatched the phone from his hand and threw it against the wall. It shattered. And then she turned on me," Green said. "She did not scream. Serena never screams. She just looked at me with that ice-cold stare and said, 'Get out.' She called the guards. It was 3 a.m. She told them to throw me out. She gave me 10 minutes to pack 40 years of my life into a suitcase. I am so sorry." "Alistair," I said, reaching out to touch his hand. "Do not be," he said, turning his hand to grip mine. His skin was dry and papery. "Because she made a mistake. In her arrogance, she thought she had won. She thought by throwing me out, she was removing the witness." He stood up slowly, his knees cracking. He walked over to a small wooden chest of drawers in the corner of the room. He opened the bottom drawer and reached under a stack of wool blankets. "But she did not know what your father gave me right before she walked into that room," Green said. He pulled out a large, thick manila envelope. It was sealed with red wax, the old-fashioned way, the way my father used to seal his most private correspondence. Green walked back to me. He held the envelope out with both hands, as if it were a holy relic. "When I heard her car coming up the drive that night," Green said, his voice trembling with emotion. Graham pulled this from under his mattress. He had kept it there, sewing it into the lining of the pillowcase, waiting for a chance to get it out of the house. He ripped the stitches and shoved it into my jacket. I stared at the envelope. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. The letters were shaky, the ink uneven, written by a hand that was losing its strength, but the name was clear. Luna. He said to me, Green whispered, tears finally spilling over his cheeks, "Keep it safe, Alistair. Keep it safe until she finds you. Tell her this is my apology. Tell her this is the fire." I stood up and took the envelope. It was heavy. It felt like it contained lead. "This is it," I said, feeling the weight of it in my soul. "This is the truth." "It is everything," Green said. "It is the will. It is the proof. It is the end of Serena Blake." I ran my thumb over the red wax seal. It was unbroken. "Thank you," I said, looking at the old man who had saved my inheritance, not of money, but of dignity. "Do not thank me," Green said, sitting back down heavily. "Just do what he asked. Burn them down. Luna, burn them all down." I clutched the envelope to my chest. The fire in the hearth seemed to roar louder, or maybe it was the blood rushing in my ears. I had the weapon. Now, I just needed to pull the trigger. "I will," I promised. "I am going to take back what is mine." I looked at the photo of my father on the mantelpiece one last time. He did not look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like a man who had been lost in the dark, who had used his last breath to light a torch and pass it to me. I would not let that light go out. I rented a small cabin at a motel near the lake, a place with knotty pine walls and a carpet that smelled of damp wool and lemon pledge. I sat at the wobbly laminate table under the buzzing yellow light of a fake Tiffany lamp, staring at the envelope Alistair Green had placed in my hands. It was heavy. It felt denser than paper should feel. The red wax seal on the back was cracked slightly, but the emblem of the Blake family, a stylized anvil and hammer, was still visible. It looked like a relic from a different century, a dramatic flourish from a man who had always believed himself to be an industrial king. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was Eli. I picked it up, but I could not bring myself to answer the video call. I could not let him see my face right now. I sent a text instead. "I am safe. I have the package. I need a few hours alone to process this. I love you." He replied instantly. "Take your time. I am right here when you come back." I put the phone face down. I needed the silence. I needed to be alone with the ghost of my father. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small utility knife I used at the shop for opening boxes of welding rods. The blade clicked as I slid it out. My hand hovered over the wax seal. I felt a physical resistance, a hesitation deep in my gut. Opening this envelope felt irrevocable. It felt like I was about to perform an autopsy on my own history. I took a breath that shuddered in my chest and sliced through the wax. It made a dry, snapping sound, like a small bone breaking. I reached inside and pulled out the contents. There were 3 distinct bundles. 2 were thick stacks of legal documents clipped together with heavy binder clips. The third was a single letter, folded into a square, written on my father's personal stationery. I pushed the letter aside. I was not ready for his voice yet. I needed the facts first. I needed the steel before the heat. I opened the first dossier. It was a last will and testament. I scanned the first page. My eyes darted to the date. It was dated 14 months ago. That was a full year before he died, 8 months before the isolation at Ravenwood began, and long before the fraudulent document Craig Mortimer had read in the tower. I turned the pages, my mechanic's fingers catching on the expensive bond paper. I looked for the names. I looked for the numbers. Graham Alexander Blake, being of sound mind and free from duress. I skipped the preamble. I went straight to the distribution of assets. Article 4, distribution of the estate, to my wife, Serena Vale Blake, and my son, Dylan Vale. I bequeath an annual stipend of $200,000 each, adjusted for inflation, to be paid from the family trust. 200,000. It was a lot of money to a normal person. To Serena, it was poverty. It was less than she spent on handbags in a season. I read on. There was a condition. This stipend is contingent upon their absolute non-interference with the operations of Northbridge Steel Group. They are to hold no board seats, no voting rights, and no executive positions. Any attempt to contest this will or interfere with the appointed leadership will result in the immediate and permanent forfeiture of all financial support. My heart hammered against my ribs. He had neutered them. He had stripped them of all power and put them on an allowance like unruly children. And then, the next paragraph, to my daughter, Luna Flores. I stopped. He had used my chosen name. Not Luna Blake, Luna Flores. He acknowledged who I had become. I bequeath the entirety of the remaining estate, including 100% of the controlling stock of Northbridge Steel Group, all real estate holdings, and the residue of all personal accounts, I gasped. The sound loud in the small room. Everything. He had left me everything. This bequest is made with the confidence that she is the only individual possessing the integrity, the skill, and the moral compass required to salvage the company from the corruption that has infected it. My only condition is that she operates the company with the transparency she once demanded of me. The document was signed at the bottom in my father's bold, sweeping signature. Next to it was the stamp and signature of a notary public, and the letterhead at the top belonged to a law firm I did not recognize. Hart Associates, Cleveland, Ohio. Evelyn Hart. He had gone outside the city. He had gone outside the state. He had found a lawyer Serena could not buy and Dylan could not intimidate. I set the will down, my hands shaking. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. He had known, for at least a year. He had known that I was right. I reached for the second stack of papers. This one was thicker. It was not a legal document. It was a crime scene. It was a dossier of evidence. My father, the man who barely knew how to send a text message, had apparently spent the last year of his lucid life acting as a corporate spy in his own company. There were emails printed out, hundreds of them. Some were between Serena and the shell company in the Caymans. Some were between Dylan and a contractor known for using substandard materials. There were bank transfer records highlighted in yellow marker. There were invoices for consulting fees that amounted to millions of dollars, paid to firms that did not exist, but it was the margins that broke me. On almost every page, my father had written notes in his distinctive, jagged scrawl. Next to an invoice signed by Serena for a phantom marketing campaign, he had written, "She thinks I am blind. She thinks I do not check the ledger anymore." Next to an email from Dylan discussing a bribe to a safety inspector, he had written, "He has no honor. He is rotting the foundation to buy a faster car." And on a summary page listing the total amount embezzled over $40 million in 5 years, he had written a note that made my throat close up. "I built this with sweat. They are tearing it down with greed. Stop them. Only Luna is tough enough to do this. Do not let the name Blake end in the dark." He had been watching them. He had been gathering ammunition, but he had been too sick, or perhaps too heartbroken, to pull the trigger himself. So he had packed the gun and buried it for me. I pushed the dossier away. The anger was rising, hot and fast, but I tamped it down. I had one more thing to read. The letter. It sat on the table. Small and unassuming, I picked it up. The paper felt fragile. I unfolded it. The handwriting was different here. It was not the bold scrawl of the margin notes. It was shaky. It wandered across the page. The letters uneven, written by a hand that was losing its battle with tremors. "My dearest Luna, if you are reading this, then I am gone. And if you are reading this, it means that the will reading in Detroit was a lie. It means they succeeded in silencing me before I could make things right publicly. It means they killed me. Luna, maybe not with a gun, but they killed me slowly, day by day, by stripping away my dignity and my voice. I brought a hand to my mouth, biting down on my knuckle to keep from sobbing. I am writing this because I am a coward. I have been a coward for a long time. I want you to know the truth about why I kicked you out that day in the office. It was not because I thought you were lying. I knew you were telling the truth. I saw the fear in Serena's eyes before she covered it up. I knew. But I was weak. I was an old man terrified of being alone. After your mother died, the silence in that house was so loud it felt like it was crushing my skull. Serena brought noise. She brought color. She made me feel like I was not just a widower waiting to die. And Dylan, I wanted so badly to have a son who would look up to me. When you walked in with those files, you held up a mirror to my life. You showed me that the woman I slept next to was a thief, and the son I spoiled was a fraud. And I hated you for it. I hated you because you were strong, and I was not. I hated you because you were the only one who respected the company enough to protect it, while I was letting them bleed it dry just to keep the peace. So I hit you. I struck the only person in the world who actually loved me for me. That slap haunts me every time I close my eyes. I would give every dollar in the bank to take it back. I am sorry I left you alone in that big house when you were a child. I told myself I was working for your future, but I was just running away from my grief. I let you grow up with staff because I was too afraid to look at you and see your mother's eyes staring back at me. You were never the traitor. Luna, you were the only loyal soldier I had. You were the threat to them because you were made of the steel I used to be proud of. I am leaving you this weapon because I know you will know how to use it, not for revenge, but for justice. Do not let them win. Take back the house. Take back the tower. And please, if you can find it in your heart, forgive an old fool who realized too late that his daughter was the best thing he ever built. Love, Dad. I put the letter down. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I simply folded my arms on the table, buried my face in them, and wept. I cried for the 10-year-old girl eating dinner alone. I cried for the 26-year-old woman who was slapped in a boardroom. I cried for the old man dying in a room that smelled of bleach, realizing that the people he paid to love him were waiting for him to expire. I cried until there were no tears left. When I finally lifted my head, the room was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The wind rattled the window pane. I felt different. The hollow ache in my chest was gone. It had been replaced by something solid, something cold and heavy and unbreakable. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater. I stood up and walked to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face and looked in the mirror. My eyes were red, but my jaw was set. I walked back to the table. I stacked the papers neatly, the will on the bottom, the evidence in the middle, the letter on top. I was not just the disinherited daughter anymore. I was not just a welder from Maine. I was the CEO of Northbridge Steel, and I had work to do. I packed the papers carefully into my bag. I checked my watch. It was 4 a.m. I did not go back to sleep. I made a pot of terrible motel coffee and drank it black. I sat by the window and watched the sun come up over the lake, turning the water from black to gray to gold. At 7 o'clock, I carried my bag to the truck. I threw it on the passenger seat. I pulled up the GPS on my phone. Hart Associates, Cleveland, Ohio. It was a 2-hour drive. I started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, a growl that sounded like a challenge. "Okay, Dad," I whispered, putting the truck in gear. "Let us go finish this." I pulled out of the parking lot, the gravel crunching under my tires, and headed for the highway. The speed limit was 65, but I had a feeling I would be going a lot faster than that. Evelyn Hart's office in Cleveland was everything the glass tower in Detroit was not. It was located in a brick building that had survived 2 world wars, smelling of furniture polish and old binding glue. The carpet was Persian and worn, and the shelves were lined with law books that had actually been read. Evelyn herself was a force of nature wrapped in a tweed suit. She was in her late 60s, with steel gray hair cut into a sharp bob, and eyes that could spot a lie from across a courtroom. She sat behind her desk, reading the documents I had brought from Mr. Green, her expression unreadable. After 20 minutes of silence, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock, she took off her reading glasses and looked at me. "This is it," she said, tapping the stack of papers. "I have the original in my safe, sealed and time-stamped, the copy you brought, combined with these emails and financial records. Luna, this is not just a lawsuit, this is a demolition." Is it enough? I asked, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from trembling. Enough. Evelyn laughed, a dry, sharp sound. In 40 years of practice, I have never seen a cleaner case of fraud, elder abuse, and coercion. We have the medical records proving Graham was isolated. We have the testimony of the butler, and we have the true will, executed when he was undeniably sound of mind. She reached for her phone. I will call the courthouse. We can file an emergency injunction within the hour. We will freeze the assets before lunch. No, I said. Evelyn paused, her hand hovering over the receiver. Excuse me. Not yet, I said. The calm in my voice surprised even me. It was the cold, hard calm of deep water. If we file now, they get a call from a lawyer. They get to hide behind their legal team. They get to spin the narrative before the truth hits them. Luna, Evelyn warned. This is dangerous. These people are desperate. I know, I said, but I need them to know it is over. I need to see them realize that the ghost they buried has climbed back out of the grave. I want to look Serena in the eye when she loses everything. Evelyn studied me for a long moment. She saw the resolve in my face, the welder's grit that had replaced the heiress's naivety. She sighed and put the phone down. Fine, she said, but we do this my way. You wear a wire. I will have a team on standby, and the moment you walk out of that house, we file the papers. No delays. Agreed, I said. I drove back to Ravenwood Estate with the windows down, letting the cold air bite at my face. The fear that had gripped me 3 nights ago was gone. In its place was a terrifying clarity. I was not driving a getaway truck anymore. I was driving a tank. When I pulled up to the iron gates, the scene was different from the night of the storm. The sun was shining, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns. The gates, which had been barred to me, stood wide open. The security guards were different, too. The private military contractors were gone, replaced by the regular day shift men who looked bored and complacent. They saw my truck and stepped out. Holding up a hand, I rolled down the window. I did not shout. I did not beg. I simply held up a document Evelyn had prepared, a notarized letter of entry, authorized by the executor of the true estate. I am here to see Serena Blake, I said. Let me in, or I will have the state police here in 10 minutes to explain why you are obstructing a federal investigation. The guard looked at the paper, then at my face. He saw something there that made him swallow hard. He stepped back and waved me through. I drove up the winding driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires sounding like applause. I parked right in front of the limestone steps where Serena had stood in her silk robe, mocking me. I walked up the steps. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the foyer. It was quiet. The house smelled of lemon verbena and expensive candles. I could hear the clinking of china coming from the drawing room to the left. I walked toward the sound. They were there. Serena and Dylan were sitting on the white Italian leather sofas, bathed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A silver tea service was on the coffee table between them, along with a bottle of champagne on ice. They were celebrating. They looked up as I entered. Dylan was the first to react. He choked on his tea, setting the cup down with a clatter. Serena froze, her hand halfway to a scone. "How did you get in here?" Dylan demanded, standing up, his face flushed with anger. "Security. Where the hell is security?" "Sit down, Dylan," I said. My voice was not loud, but it echoed off the high ceilings with absolute authority. Serena recovered her composure slowly. She placed her plate down and smoothed her skirt. She looked at me with a mix of amusement and pity. "Really, Luna," she sighed. "We have already done this. You were cut out. The will was read. Coming back here to beg is beneath even you." "I am not here to beg," I said. I walked further into the room, my boots leaving faint traces of dust on the Persian rug. "And I am not here to fight." "Then what do you want?" Dylan sneered. "Did you come to steal some silverware, or did you just want to see what winners look like one last time?" "I came to talk," I said. "Like family, no lawyers, no press, just us, and the truth." We have nothing to say to you, Serena said, reaching for her phone. I am calling the police. You are trespassing. I would not do that, I said, reaching into my bag. Not unless you want them to hear the recording I have in my pocket. Serena paused. Her thumb hovered over the screen. What recording? I walked to the coffee table. I did not sit. I stood over them, casting a shadow that fell across the silver tray. I pulled out a large manila envelope, a copy of the one Mr. Green had given me, and placed it on the table. 3 nights ago, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Serena. Graham called me. You know he did. You broke the phone. But you made a mistake. Serena, you thought the phone call was the weapon. It was not. It was just the signal. You are speaking nonsense, Serena said, but her voice lacked its usual steel. She eyed the envelope. Open it, I said. Dylan scoffed. I am not playing your games. Open it, I repeated, sharper this time, or I will open it for the FBI agents who are waiting for my call. Dylan looked at Serena. She gave a barely perceptible nod. He reached forward and ripped the envelope open. He pulled out the stack of papers. The first thing he saw was the last will and testament. We already did this, Dylan muttered, flipping the page. This is just... Wait. He stopped. He read the header. Hart Associates. He looked at the date. 14 months ago, Dylan whispered. Keep reading, I said. Read Article 4. Dylan's eyes scanned the page. His face went from flush to a sickly shade of gray. What is it? Serena asked, her voice tight. Dylan stammered. He left it all to her, 100%. The company, the house, everything. That is impossible, Serena snapped. She snatched the papers from his hand. Her eyes darted across the text. I watched her. I watched the exact moment the reality hit her. $200,000 a year, I quoted from memory. A stipend, an allowance, contingent on your absolute non-interference. Serena looked up at me. Her face was pale, the makeup standing out like paint on a corpse. This is a forgery, she hissed. Graham would never do this. He loved us. Did he? I asked. Or did he just tolerate you until he realized you were parasites? I reached into the envelope and pulled out the second stack, the evidence. I tossed it onto the table. It fanned out, revealing the emails, the bank transfers, the margin notes in Graham's handwriting. He knew. Serena, I said softly. He knew about the Cayman accounts. He knew about the bribes. He spent the last year of his life collecting every receipt. Look at the notes. That is his handwriting. You cannot forge that. Serena stared at the papers. Her hand began to shake. It started as a tremor in her fingers and traveled up her arm until her whole body was vibrating. She reached for her teacup, purely out of instinct, to steady herself, but her hand jerked, and the cup tipped over. Dark liquid spilled across the white table, dripping onto the expensive rug. No one moved to clean it up. He was senile, Dylan shouted, standing up and backing away. He was crazy. This proves nothing. The will we read yesterday is the newest one. It supersedes this. The will you read yesterday, I said, was signed 6 months ago by a man who was heavily medicated, isolated from his family, and coerced by the people who were supposed to care for him. I pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen. I visited Evelyn Hart this morning, I said. She recorded the signing of the true will. Would you like to hear it? I did not wait for an answer. I pressed play. Graham Blake's voice filled the room. It was not the weak, wheezing voice from the phone call. It was weaker than his prime, yes, but it was clear. It was firm. I, Graham Blake, am signing this document of my own free will. I am leaving everything to my daughter, Luna Flores. She is the only one with the strength to save what I built. Those who are currently in my house, they are waiting for me to die. If they produce another will after this date, know that it was created under duress. I consider them traitors to this family. The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. Serena sat frozen. the spilled tea dripping steadily onto the floor. Drip, drip, drip. Dylan looked like a trapped animal. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, looking for a weapon. "You bitch!" Dylan screamed. He lunged at the table. He grabbed the stack of papers, the will, the evidence, the notes, and began to tear them. "Dylan, stop!" Serena shrieked, but he was too far gone. He ripped the papers in half, then in quarters. He threw the confetti into the air. He grabbed the rest and crumpled it, hurling it into the fireplace where a decorative log was burning. "There," he yelled, turning to me, his chest heaving, his face twisted into a mask of madness. "It is gone. It does not exist. You have nothing. Get out of my house." I watched the paper burn. I watched the flames lick at the edges of the document. I did not move. I did not try to stop him. I just watched, a cold, small smile touching my lips. "You idiot," I said. Dylan froze. "You really think I would bring the original documents into a room with you?" I asked. "Into a house full of thieves." I took a step forward. "That was a photocopy. Dylan, it cost me 10 cents at the library." I pointed a finger at him. "The original will," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream, "is sitting in a fireproof vault in Cleveland. The evidence has already been digitized and sent to the district attorney, and the recording that is on a secure server." Dylan looked at the fireplace. He looked at the ashes. He realized, with a dawning horror, that his tantrum had accomplished nothing but proving his own guilt. Serena slowly stood up. She looked older than I had ever seen her. The mask of the perfect socialite had cracked, revealing the frightened, desperate woman underneath. "We can make a deal," she said. Her voice was trembling. "Luna, listen to me. We can work this out. We can split it, 50-50. You do not want a scandal. Think of the stock price." "The stock price?" I laughed. "You think I care about the stock price?" "We are family," Serena pleaded, taking a step toward me. "Graham would not want us to fight." "Graham wanted you in jail," I said. Suddenly, Serena's phone began to ring. It was sitting on the table, right next to the puddle of spilled tea. The screen lit up. Attorney General's office. Serena stared at it. She did not pick it up. "That," I said, nodding at the phone, "is not for a lunch date." The phone continued to ring. Then, it stopped. Immediately. Dylan's phone began to buzz in his pocket. "Answer it," I said. Dylan pulled his phone out. He looked at the screen. His hand went limp, and the phone clattered to the floor. "It is Mortimer," Dylan whispered. He says there are police at his office. He says there is a warrant." Serena collapsed back onto the sofa. She covered her face with her hands. I looked at them. The king and queen of the steel tower, reduced to a pile of nerves and fear in a room they no longer owned. I felt a strange lightness in my chest. It was not joy. It was the lifting of a burden I had carried for 8 years. I turned around and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Dylan called out, his voice cracking. "You cannot just leave us here." I stopped at the threshold of the living room. I turned back one last time. "I am not leaving you," I said. I looked at Serena, who was peeking through her fingers, and then at Dylan, who was shaking in the middle of the room. "I am just stepping out of the way," I said, "because, stepmother, this time, I am the one who invited justice into this house, and she is parking in the driveway right now." I walked out into the foyer, through the glass panels of the front door. I could see the flashing blue and red lights of the state police cruisers coming up the long driveway. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was sweet and clean. I walked past the arriving officers, nodding to them as they rushed up the steps. I walked down the driveway, past the iron gates, and toward my truck. I did not look back at the house. I did not need to. I knew exactly what was happening inside. The fire was finally burning. The day of the trial. The state courthouse looked less like a hall of justice and more like the scene of a gladiatorial match. The corridor leading to courtroom 4B was a crush of bodies. There were reporters with cameras perched on their shoulders like vultures. shouting questions that merged into a wall of noise. There were investors in expensive suits, looking pale and worried about their portfolios. And behind them, standing in silent rows, were the workers, men and women in denim jackets and steel-toed boots, people who had lost their pensions or been injured by the substandard steel Northbridge had been pumping out under Serena's leadership. I walked through the center of the chaos. I was not wearing designer silk or a power suit from a glossy magazine. I wore a simple navy blazer and slacks, clothes I had bought off the rack at a department store in Maine. My hair was pulled back. I held a single leather folder in my hand. I did not look at the cameras. I kept my head high, fixing my eyes on the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of lemon polish and old wood. The gallery was packed to capacity. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table next to Evelyn Hart. Beside her sat Marcus Thorne, a young criminal prosecutor with eyes like a hawk, who had taken the lead on the state's charges. On the other side of the aisle, the defense table looked like a sinking ship. Serena sat rigidly in the center. She was trying to maintain the illusion of the Ice Queen, wearing a black dress that likely cost $10,000. But the cracks were visible. Her skin was sallow, covered by a layer of foundation that was slightly too thick. There were dark, bruised circles under her eyes that no concealer could hide. Her hands, resting on the table, were picking at a loose thread on her cuff, a nervous tic she could not control. Dylan looked worse. He looked like he had not slept in a week. His tie was crooked, his collar unbuttoned, and his eyes were bloodshot and frantic. He kept glancing at the door as if expecting a rescue team that was never coming. The judge, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, banged the gavel. The sound cut through the murmuring of the crowd like a gunshot. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The trial began not with a whimper, but with a roar. Evelyn Hart stood up. She did not pace. She did not use flowery language. She simply laid out the facts as if she were building a foundation. "We are here to prove that the defendants, Serena Vale Blake and Dylan Vale, engaged in a systematic conspiracy to defraud Graham Blake, abuse a vulnerable adult, and embezzle over $40 million from Northbridge Steel," Evelyn said, her voice ringing clear. She signaled to the tech support. Exhibit A, the massive screen on the wall, flickered to life. It was the video Evelyn had recorded 14 months ago in her Cleveland office. A gasp went through the room. Graham Blake filled the screen. He looked thinner than the public remembered, but his eyes were sharp. He was sitting in a leather chair, holding a document. Graham Blake," the video version of my father said, his voice steady, "am recording this to ensure my true wishes are honored. I am of sound mind. I am not under duress." He looked directly into the camera lens. It felt like he was looking right at me across time and space. "I leave everything to my daughter, Luna Flores," he said. "She is the only one who ever told me the truth. To my wife and son, I leave a stipend, on the condition that they never touch my company again. They have lost that right." The video cut to black. In the courtroom, the silence was absolute. I looked at the jury. They were leaning forward, captivated. Then I looked at Serena. She was staring at the blank screen, her jaw tight. "The prosecution calls Craig Mortimer," Marcus announced. The doors opened, and the Blake family's former lawyer walked in. He looked smaller than he had in the boardroom. He walked with a stoop, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially Serena. He had cut a deal, immunity in exchange for the truth. He took the stand, swore on the Bible, and sat down. "Mr. Mortimer," Marcus asked, pacing in front of the jury box, "did you knowingly draft a fraudulent will for Graham Blake 6 months ago?" "I did," Mortimer whispered. "Speak up, please," the judge instructed. "I did," Mortimer said, his voice trembling. "And why did you do that?" Marcus asked. "Because Serena Blake paid me," Mortimer said. The crowd erupted into whispers. The judge banged the gavel. "She wired $500,000 to an offshore account in my name. She told me that Graham was incompetent, that he needed to be protected from himself. She gave me the terms. I drafted it. I destroyed the previous drafts she had brought to me. Did Graham Blake read this new will? No, Mortimer said, looking at his hands. He was heavily sedated when I brought it to the bedroom. Dylan held his hand and guided the pen. Graham was barely conscious. I closed my eyes. I could see it. The image made my stomach turn. Your witness, Marcus said to the defense. Serena's lawyer, a high-priced shark from New York, tried to rattle him, asking if he was lying to save his own skin. But Mortimer simply pointed to the bank records projected on the screen. The money trail was undeniable. $500,000, transferred 3 days before the fake will was signed. Next came the emotional blow. The prosecution calls Alistair Green. Mr. Green walked to the stand with dignity, though he leaned heavily on a cane. He wore his best suit, pressed and clean. He looked like the grandfather everyone wished they had. When he began to speak, the air in the room grew heavy. He described the atmosphere in Ravenwood during those final months. He described the medical protocol Serena had instituted. She controlled the morphine pump, Green said, his voice breaking. If he agreed with her, he got relief. If he asked to see Luna, or if he refused to sign a check, she would turn it off. She would let him gasp for air for hours. A woman in the jury covered her mouth. And Dylan? Marcus asked gently. He called his father a rotting corpse, Green said, looking directly at Dylan, who shrank into his chair. He would come in, scream at him to hurry up and die, and leave. He hit the bed frame to scare him. He terrorized a man who could not lift his head from the pillow. Objection, the defense lawyer shouted. Hearsay. I saw it, Green said firmly. I saw it through the door, and I heard Graham crying afterwards. He was a strong man, but they broke him. They broke him to get the money. I wiped a tear from my cheek. I did not look away. I needed to witness this for him. Then Noah Ramirez took the stand. He was clinical, precise. He walked the jury through the security logs. Here, Noah said, using a laser pointer on the screen. This is the log for Dr. Aris, the family physician for 20 years. His access was revoked on October 4th. The next day, a concierge medical team hired by Ironclad Solutions, a company owned by a shell corporation linked to Serena Blake, took over. There are no medical charts for the last 3 months of Graham Blake's life. They were deleted. The defense team tried to paint a different picture. When it was their turn, they did not call witnesses to refute the facts because they had none. Instead, they attacked me. Luna Flores, the defense attorney said, pacing in front of the jury, is an estranged daughter who was fired for incompetence years ago. She has been living in poverty. Is it not possible that she forged these documents? Is it not possible that this is all a revenge scheme by a greedy child who felt left out? Serena nodded vigorously from her table, trying to look like the victim of a vindictive stepdaughter. Evelyn Hart stood up. We would like to enter one final piece of evidence into the record. Exhibit D, the original, handwritten letter found with the will. She handed the fragile paper to the bailiff, who projected it onto the screen. I watched the jury read my father's shaky handwriting. I watched them mouth the words, I am writing this because I am a coward. I hit you because you showed me the truth. If Luna is reading this, please forgive the cowardice of your father and use your honesty to set things right. It was raw. It was real. It was not the writing of a senile man. It was the confession of a man full of regret. The defense lawyer looked at the screen and knew he had lost the emotional war, but he still had a legal argument. He argued that the letter was undated, that it could have been written years ago, that it proved nothing about the will. We have one final rebuttal witness, Evelyn said. We recall Craig Mortimer to the stand. Mortimer looked even paler this time. He sat down. Mr. Mortimer, Evelyn said, you testified that you drafted the fake will, but you also provided the state with a digital file yesterday morning. What is that file? It is a voice memo, Mortimer said quietly. I recorded it on my phone during a meeting in the library at Ravenwood. I wanted insurance, in case they tried to blame me later. Please play the recording, Evelyn said. The courtroom speakers crackled. Then, Serena's voice filled the room. It was crystal clear. I do not care if he is in pain. Craig, if he does not sign, leave him there. Lower the dosage. Eventually, the pain will make him obedient. And if he dies before he signs, we just backdate the new draft. Who is going to stop us? The gardener. I own this house. We win either way. Serena let out a small, strangled cry. She stood up, knocking her chair over. That is illegal, she screamed, her voice shrill and panicked. You cannot use that. That was private. Sit down, Mrs. Blake, the judge bellowed. It is a lie, Serena shouted, pointing at me. She doctored it. She is a welder. She is trash. Dylan put his head in his hands and began to sob. It was not a cry of remorse. It was the cry of a child who realizes the game is over. The jury did not need to hear any more. They looked at Serena with open revulsion. The recording was the nail in the coffin, the hammer driving it home. The deliberation took less than 2 hours. When the jury returned, the foreman, a middle-aged mechanic who looked like he knew the value of hard work, stood up. In the matter of the state versus Serena Vale Blake and Dylan Vale, he read, we find the defendants guilty on all counts. Guilty of forgery, guilty of fraud, guilty of embezzlement, and most damning of all, guilty of the abuse of a vulnerable adult. The judge was not lenient. Serena Blake, the judge said, looking down from the bench with eyes like flint. You took a position of trust and turned it into a weapon. You tortured a dying man for profit. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison. Serena screamed. It was a raw, animal sound. She was grabbed by the bailiffs as she tried to lunge toward the defense table. Dylan Vale, the judge continued, for your role in this conspiracy and your callous disregard for human life, I sentence you to 8 years. Dylan did not scream. He went limp, letting the officers drag him up. Furthermore, the judge ruled, slamming the gavel, the court recognizes the will dated 14 months ago as the only valid last will and testament of Graham Blake. All assets, properties, and holdings are hereby restored to the sole beneficiary, Luna Flores. The room erupted. The reporters were shouting. The investors were gasping. I sat still. I felt Evelyn's hand on my shoulder, squeezing tight. I watched the bailiffs handcuff Serena. She looked back at me one last time. Her eyes were wild, filled with hate. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just looked at her with the steady, unblinking gaze of someone who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. It is done, I whispered. I stood up. The noise of the courtroom washed over me like the ocean. I turned to Mr. Green, who was sitting in the front row. He was crying, tears streaming down his weathered face. He nodded to me. I walked out of the courtroom. The reporters swarmed, microphones thrust in my face, asking how it felt to be the billionaire owner of Northbridge Steel. Ms. Flores, what is your first move? I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps. I looked out at the city skyline, at the jagged teeth of the buildings my father had helped build. My first move, I said, my voice quiet but firm, is to clean up the mess. I walked down the steps, leaving the circus behind. The empire was mine now, but I knew that the hardest work was just beginning. I had to turn a tomb back into a company, and I had to do it with clean hands. 3 weeks after the gavel fell and the prison doors closed behind Serena and Dylan, I walked back into the lobby of Northbridge Tower. The air conditioning was just as cold as I remembered, and the marble floors were just as polished. But the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of a mausoleum. It was the held breath of a giant waiting to see if it would be allowed to live. I took the elevator to the 60th floor alone. I did not bring an entourage. I did not bring bodyguards. I wore my steel-toed boots and a tailored blazer, a visual bridge between the two worlds I now inhabited. When the doors opened, the receptionist, a young woman who had likely been hired for her silence as much as her skills, stood up so fast she knocked her chair back. Ms. Flores, she stammered. The board is waiting. Thank you, I said. I walked down the long glass hallway. I could feel the ghosts of the past 8 years walking beside me. The 26-year-old girl who had been slapped, the welder who had scraped grease from under her fingernails, the daughter who had been told she was nothing. I pushed open the double doors to the conference room. The conversation inside died instantly. 12 men and women sat around the black granite table. These were the survivors, the ones who had not been directly implicated in Serena's fraud, but who had certainly enjoyed the dividends of her corruption. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and calculation. They were wondering if I was going to be a tyrant or a pushover. I walked to the head of the table. My father's chair was there. It was a massive thing, upholstered in black leather that had been worn smooth by his back over 30 years. It looked like a throne. For a moment, I just stared at it. I thought about the man who had sat there, a titan who had let himself be whittled down to a frightened invalid. I did not stand behind it. I pulled it out and sat down. The leather creaked. It felt too big. But I did not shrink. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the cold stone table. Good morning, I said. My voice was not loud, but in the acoustic perfection of the room, it sounded like a hammer strike. Good morning, Madam Chairwoman. A man to my right said. That was Thomas Thorne, the CFO. He had signed off on some of the questionable audits, always claiming ignorance. I looked at him. I looked at all of them. Let us be clear about why I'm sitting here, I said. I am not here because I wanted this job. I am here because the previous administration turned this company into a criminal enterprise. Thorne shifted uncomfortably. Now, Luna, those are harsh words. We were all misled by Serena. She was very persuasive. Stop, I said. The word cut through his excuse like a torch through butter. Do not lie to me. Thomas, you are an accountant. You saw the numbers. You knew money was going to the Caymans. You knew we were buying subpar ore from sanctioned suppliers. You stayed silent because your bonus checks cleared. The room went deadly quiet. Here is the new reality, I continued, sliding a thick folder across the table. This company is done with secrets. We are done with shell companies. We are done with black envelopes of cash passed under the table to inspectors. We are done with cutting corners. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the sprawling city. You have a choice, I said, turning back to face them. Either you relearn how to do business honestly, meaning you actually make a product worth buying, or you leave this building before the sun goes down today. Luna, another board member spoke up. Reforming the supply chain will cost us millions. The shareholders will revolt. The shareholders, I said, are lucky they still have a company to own. And regarding the cost, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of envelopes. I walked around the table, dropping one in front of specific people. Thorne got one. The VP of Operations got one. The head of Human Resources got one. What is this? Thorne asked, staring at the white envelope. Your resignation, I said, effective immediately. You cannot do this, he sputtered, his face turning red. I have tenure. I have a contract. You have a choice, I corrected him. You can sign that and leave with your pension intact. Or you can stay, and I will hand over your personal email logs to the district attorney who just put my stepmother in prison for 15 years. Thorne went pale. He looked at the envelope, then at me. He picked up his pen. By noon, 5 of the 12 board members were gone. Security escorted them out with their boxes of personal effects. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I was cauterizing a wound. That afternoon, I met with the independent auditors I had hired. They were forensic accountants, the best in the business. Tear it apart, I told them. I want to know where every cent went. If we owe taxes, we pay them. If we underpaid workers, we reimburse them. If we screwed a client, we make it right. This is going to be expensive, Ms. Flores, the lead auditor warned me. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in restitution and fines. It could wipe out the profit margin for the next 5 years. Do it, I said without hesitation. I would rather run a broke company that has a soul than a rich one that is rotten. The biggest check I wrote was to the Class Action Trust. It was for the families of construction workers who had been injured when a scaffolding rig built with Northbridge steel collapsed 2 years ago. Serena had buried the report and paid off the inspectors. I sat at my father's desk and wrote the figure $50 million. My hand did not shake. It was a lot of money. It was a fortune. But as I signed Luna Flores at the bottom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was the price of the hereditary sin. I was buying back the family name, $1 at a time, the next week. I drove to Ravenwood Estate. It was a beautiful day, but the house still looked like a fortress to me. I walked through the empty halls. The furniture was still there, covered in dust sheets that looked like ghosts. I walked into the master bedroom. The smell of bleach was gone, replaced by the stale air of abandonment. I stood by the bed where my father had died. I tried to feel his presence, but all I could feel was the coldness of the room. This house had never been a home. It had been a stage set for Serena's ambition and a prison for my father's grief. I walked out to the driveway where a real estate agent was waiting for me. She was looking at the limestone facade with greedy eyes. "It is magnificent, Ms. Flores," she gushed. "We can list it for $20 million. The market is hot." "List it for 15, I said. "I want it gone." 15. She blinked. "But you are leaving money on the table." "I am not selling a house," I said, getting into my truck. "I am evicting a memory. Sell it fast. Sell it to someone who does not know the name Blake, and donate the proceeds to the Children's Hospital." I drove away and did not look back. I did not move into a penthouse. I did not buy a yacht. I bought a house on the coast, about 20 miles south of the city. It was large. Yes, I had money now, and I was not going to pretend to be poor, but it was warm. It was built of cedar and glass, sitting on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. It had big windows that let in the light, not to show off, but to let the sun warm the floors. Eli loved it. He set up his drafting studio in the loft, overlooking the ocean. He said the light was perfect for designing hulls, and in the backyard, past the garden where we planted tomatoes and wildflowers, I built a workshop. It was not a hobby shed. It was a fully equipped fabrication shop. I installed a TIG welder, a plasma cutter, and an anvil that weighed 300 pounds. I hung a sign over the door, hand-painted on a piece of drift metal, Northbridge Foundry. Reforged. It was my sanctuary. On weekends, I would leave the CEO's office, take off the blazer, and put on my leather apron. I would melt steel. I would beat it into shape. I made gates. I made sculptures. I made toys for the neighbors' kids. It was a reminder. Steel can be rusted. It can be twisted. It can be used to build a cage. But if you apply enough heat, if you have the strength to hammer it, you can melt it down and make it into something new, something better. My father was the old steel, brittle, flawed. I was the new pour. One Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, I drove to the cemetery. The leaves were turning gold and crimson, carpeting the ground in fire. I walked to the family plot. It was quiet. The grass had grown over the fresh earth of my father's grave. I stood there for a long time. I did not pray. I just talked. "You were a coward, Dad," I said to the headstone. "And you left me a mess." A wind rustled the leaves, sounding like a sigh. "But you came through in the end," I conceded. "You gave me the hammer, and I used it." I reached into my bag and pulled out a copy of the true will, the one he had signed in secret, the one that had saved me. I placed it on the grass, weighing it down with a small gear I had welded into a perfect circle, a symbol of continuity. "I fired Thorne," I told him, "and I sold the house. Serena is in a federal facility in Connecticut. She is sewing mail bags for 12 cents an hour. I thought you would appreciate the irony of her finally doing manual labor." I touched the cold stone of the marker. "I did my part," I whispered. "The company is clean. The name is clean. The rest is up to how you want to remember yourself." I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees. I felt light. The grief was still there. A small stone in my pocket. But the anger was gone. I had burned it all in the furnace of the last few months. I walked back to my truck. I had a meeting at 3. The final scene of this chapter of my life took place back in the boardroom. But this time, the table was not filled with suits and nervous accountants. It was filled with union representatives, foremen in work shirts, and safety inspectors. We had just finished signing a new collective bargaining agreement. It included better health care, stricter safety protocols, and a profit-sharing model that meant when the company did well, the workers did well. "This is good, Ms. Flores," the union head said, shaking my hand. His grip was rough, like mine. "Your father, he would never have signed this." "I am not my father," I said simply. The meeting adjourned. The room emptied out until I was alone. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked down at the industrial district of Detroit. Far below, I could see the smokestacks of the main Northbridge plant. For years, that smoke had been black and thick, a sign of cheap filters and corners cut. Today, the smoke rising into the crisp autumn air was white and thin. It was clean steam. I placed my hand against the glass. I saw my reflection. I did not see the scared girl who had run away to Maine. I saw a woman who had been forged in the fire, hammered by betrayal, and quenched in the truth. They had tried to erase me. They had tried to cut me out of the story. "They cut me out of the will," I whispered to the city below. But in the end, their own hands wrote my name back into the history of this company. I watched the white steam rise, dissolving into the blue sky, finally free. I turned off the lights in the boardroom and walked out, ready to go home to the sound of the ocean and the man who loved me not for my name, but for my steel. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed Luna's journey from betrayal to triumph, please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to Maya Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help more people hear the truth. Your support means the world to me. Stay strong.